Good afternoon, everyone. I am Samantha Estresa and I am the discussant for today. And my topic is all about the chronology of Jesus' life. The date of Jesus' birth. According to both Matthew and Luke, Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. The Jewish historian Josephus confirms that Herod died in the 34th year of his reign, the equivalent of 4 BC in our calendar. This means that our calendar, which was developed by the 6th century monk Dionysius Exiguus, has the birth of Jesus miscalculated by at least 4 years. Most scholars place Jesus' birth sometime between 7 and 4 BC. There is little other evidence to establish a more precise date. The census to which Luke refers cannot be dated with certainty. And we do not know how long Joseph and Mary were in Egypt before Herod died. Attempts have also been made to identify the Star of Bethlehem with a particular astral phenomenon. As early as 1606, the astronomer Johannes Kepler suggested that the star may have been a nova or supernova, the explosion of a star. There are records of such a nova seen by Chinese astronomer in 5 or 4 BC. Kepler also noted a conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn, which occurred in the constellation Pisces in the year 7 BC. This later event is intriguing since Pisces was sometimes associated with the Hebrews and with the end times. Saturn with the Syria-Palestinian region, the Jupiter with the world ruler. This could explain why the Magi came to Israel looking for a king, but all of these proposals remain speculative and hypothetical, and the star could have been any number of natural or supernatural phenomena. So, Johannes Kepler suggested that the star is a supernova or a nova. The month or even the season of Jewish birth is also uncertain. The traditional date of the Western Church is December 25th, and in some Eastern churches is January 6th. The former seems to have arisen in the time of Constantine. Perhaps to replace the pagan feast of Saturnalia, the only clue from the text is Luke's reference to shepherds living outside, which would normally occur during the warmer months. Perhaps March through November. On the other hand, there is some rabbinic evidence for year-round grazing. So, a December date is not impossible. It is said that December, which is the Western Church celebrating the birth of Jesus, is not impossible. So now, let's move on to the date of Jesus' ministry. While Jesus' ministry began sometime around AD 30, the precise year is uncertain. Luke says that the ministry of John the Baptist began in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius became emperor in AD 14 and the death of his stepfather, Augustus, and reigned until AD 37. John's ministry would then have begun about AD 29 and Jesus shortly after, perhaps AD 30. A difficulty arises. However, since Tiberius became co-regent with Augustus in AD 11 or 12, following this earlier date, Jesus' ministry have begun around AD 26 to 27. It is said that Jesus' ministry had begun around AD 26 or 27. Possible support for this earlier date comes from John chapter 2 verse 20, whereon Jesus' first Passover visit to Jerusalem. The Jews claimed that it has taken 46 years to build the temple. According to Josephus, Herod began rebuilding the temple in the 18th year of his reign, about 20 or 19 BC. 46 years from this comes to about AD 27 or 28. There is no year 0. So let's look at this figure 13.1, which is the chronology of John's Gospel. John chapter 2 verse 13, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So the first Passover is between spring AD or 30. Next is chapter 4 verse 35. Do you not say 4 months more and then the harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields, they are ripe for harvest. So if a literal reference could be late AD 27 or early 28. The barley harvest was in March and the wheat in April and May. So chapter 5 verse 1, sometime later Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. An unnamed feast, perhaps tabernacles, in fall of AD 28 or AD 31. So John chapter 6 verse 4, the Jewish Passover feast was near. So third Passover or second name, spring AD 29 or AD 32, Jesus remains in Galilee. Chapter 7 verse 2, but when the Jewish feast of tabernacles was near, therefore tabernacles fall AD 29 or AD 32. Next is chapter 10 verse 22. Then came the feast of dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter. Hanukkah, winter AD 29 or AD 32. Next is John chapter 11 verse 55. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. Luke identifies Jesus' age at the beginning of his ministry as about 30 years old in chapter 3 verse 23, an approximation which would fit either earlier or later dates. If Jesus was born between 7 and 4 BC, he would have been from 33 to 36 years old in AD 30 or 30 to 33 years old in AD 27. While either date works, a slight edge may be given to the later, with a public ministry beginning about AD 27. The length of Jesus' ministry is also uncertain. As we have seen, the Synoptic Gospel mention only one Passover, but John refers to 3. In John chapter 2 verse 13, chapter 6 verse 4, and chapter 11 verse 55. This would make the length of Jesus' ministry between 21/2 and 31/2 years. We must be cautious here. However, since John's chronology may not be precise, if John moved the cleansing of the temple from the end of Jesus' ministry to the beginning, the Passover mentioned, there would be an anachronistic reference to Jesus' last Passover. This will produce a ministry of 11 to 21 years, since we have favored two separate temple clearings. We follow the longer chronology. So let's now move on to the date of Jesus' crucifixion. The Gospel suggests that Jesus ate the Last Supper with his disciples on Thursday evening of Passover week and was crucified on Friday. So Jesus is crucified on Friday. He was buried shortly before the Sabbath on Friday evening. The actual date of the crucifixion is more difficult to determine and depends on our conclusion concerning the day Passover occurred in the year. This in turn too complicated by the differences between the Synoptics and John, which seem to present Jesus and the religious leaders celebrating Passover on different days. Passover takes place on the 15th of Nisan. Since the Jewish day begins at dusk, Passover begins in the evening of Nisan 14 with the Passover meal and concludes the next afternoon, the Nisan 15. The issue is still more complicated since Jews figured their calendar with reference to the new moon. which was not always a precise reading. Astronomers have concluded that Passover probably came on Friday in both AD 30 and 33. This again makes both the early and late dates for Jesus' ministry possible. The earlier date has Jesus' ministry beginning in AD 26 or 27, and his crucifixion is Passover of AD 30. The later date has the ministry beginning at AD 29 or 30 and the crucifixion in AD 33. So, the date of Jesus' ministry begins at AD 29 or 30 and his crucifixion is AD 33.